I want to call the Board of County Commissioners Land Use Workshop to order. Before we get started, I want to read into the record a memorandum from Commissioner Stacy White. Said, Commissioner, I will be unable to attend today's land use workshop due to unforeseen family and medical circumstances. Please read this reason for my absence into the record. I understand he had a family emergency, that someone had to have emergency surgery last night, so let's keep the family in prayer. Commissioners, this is the fourth workshop on land use that we're having in the last year. It is time to move the needle forward on our land use decisions and discussion. We have talked about many issues. Each commissioner has raised a number of important items related to the topic. Staff has a list of those issues for us today. If there are issues that have not been identified, this is the time to add them to the list. Again, this is the time to add them to the list. Staff of the County Administrator and the Planning Commission have been working on a number of projects related to issues important to you. You will hear a summary of those projects today. It is a tight agenda and is not designed to debate the projects or projects you may want to add to the list. Staff will bring those back in the subsequent workshops. Since this is a workshop, we will not take votes, but treat this like a future issues list on the regular agenda items. I've been here for a number of years and have witnessed divisiveness and controversy amongst our planning professionals. I'm here to tell you that today we have collaboration and partnership working to address our long-term planning policies and short-term implementation of those policies. With that, I'm going to turn it over to staff to take us through our presentation. You have an agenda with time frames at the dais. We're going to adhere to those time frames. We're going to be out here at 11 o'clock. I understand there are other commitments that others of us have. So do I. We will be out of here at 11 o'clock. As we do in the House of Representatives, Senate, we're going to move, we rise at 11 o'clock. We're going to keep those time frames knowing that this is an initial conversation on these topics and we will be back visiting these again. But commissioners, we have to move these items forward. We got to move them fast. Mr. Merrill?
Oh, that was a great introduction. I'll just turn it over to Lithia.
Good morning, Commissioners. Lucia Garces, Deputy County Administrator, and
Melissa Zornita, Executive Director of the Hillsborough County City-County Planning Commission.
Oh, you going to sing a song for us today, Dawn?
we could. We could.
We certainly kept them dancing.
Commissioners, thank you for this opportunity to present some of the projects that we've worked on and to really get a sense to ensure that what we're hearing is important to you as we move forward. I think the one thing as a housekeeping item that I'd like to say is that we were a bit challenged in getting the agenda books out. And so some of the materials, agenda came out, the PowerPoints came out, but some of the backup additional material came out on Monday. And just in case some folks couldn't open it, so we did provide a big book to you. We are cognizant of using paper, so if you don't need some of those projects that are listed in there, be happy to take them back. But if not, for those of you who are still tactile and need to take notes on them, feel free to do so. So today, as Commissioner Miller said, we are here to pop me up. I can't see that far.
Which one of these? No, those are plan amendments.
We'll do the plan.
We don't, this is what we have right
No, I can't see it.
now.
I don't see it.
You can go ahead and talk about what it's-
Okay. All right, we'll start slowly. And you have the PowerPoints behind you. This is truly a technically challenged event that we're having. Let me just start with saying that we're going to proceed. We're just on the fly. We can make things happen. So here's the land use agenda for today. And Melissa, if you could go to the agenda piece that we're talking about, because there are really three things. The first one is going to be what's important to you, and those are things that we've heard you say at high level and detail level. And then what are we working on? Because there's a whole compendium of a body of work that's been done by staff that we believe touches one way or another some of the things that you've been talking about. And we think those need to come back to you in conversations. And then we need to hear what else is important to you, what else we should be working on. And so with Commissioner Miller's timeframes, Melissa and I hope to be finished by 9:30 at the latest, 9:25, to give you opportunity to talk. Once that's done, there is a major project that's been underway that was initiated by this board sitting as the EPC a couple of years ago, where there was an interest to understand all of the work associated with sea level rise and perils of flood, and what we're doing about vulnerability assessment. We have engaged with the University of South Florida's Florida Center for Community Design. Taryn Sabia and her group are here to present the first work, the assessment of that work that's been done. Many items to still follow. That, and Melissa will talk about a little bit about that, but that is really a partnership that started with the EPC, the Planning Commission, and us as well. So if I could, Melissa, do you have okay, there you go.
I can talk from here, right? Okay, great. Hi. So to start off with some of the things that we have heard from you all, we started with sort of the big picture, big things that we've heard as areas of interest from you all. Things like affordable housing, the idea of having choices and maintaining a choice of places that people could live in our community, from urban, suburban to rural, looking at our community plans, looking at the idea of creating more focal points with nodes in our community, creating that sense of place, improving the way our corridors look from a complete street standpoint, analysis of the cost of growth, issues of equity, health in all policies, incentivizing targeted growth and economic development in the right places, creating opportunities for people to live, work, and play, making sure that throughout all of this that we have public engagement, the resiliency piece, which Lucia has already mentioned, issues of smart growth and how we can manage the growth that is coming towards our community better, and then the very important issues of safety and Vision Zero. So these are some of the bigger overarching themes that we have heard from you all in a series of workshops, whether they be on land use or on topics like stormwater. These issues all interrelate, and so we've heard these from you in a lot of different places. And I think now it goes back to Lucia and corridors and nodes.
Thank you, Melissa. I think I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about this slide that's called Corridors, Nodes, and Preservation. Because when we listen to you and we hear a lot of the topics that are important to you, whether it's transportation, community plans, whether we're talking about the IP district, Brandon redevelopment, Ruskin, whether we're talking about preserving the rural land, it's breaking up in our minds, and we're not committed to this. We just offer this as a way of kind of thinking about corridors, nodes, and preservation. And so corridors are those linear things that link to communities. And early on, corridors linked Lutz to Fort Brooke and provided a path for some of the lumber to be brought to Fort Brooke. Later on, some of the corridors included riverines. Riverview is named for moving a lot of the agricultural components of our community down rivers. They were for commerce. Later we had rail lines that created opportunities for alternative ways. Then we built roads. We built small roads connecting inside communities. We built bigger roads, and then we built an interstate system. And all of those things, all of those corridors, the way they functioned, the distance that one could travel. A horse traveled 30 miles a day, and so it was, there were towns often that you could see every 30 miles. So understanding how corridors work becomes really important to us in connecting nodes. And the nodes can be today, they can be the communities that we started with, the Lutzes, the Riverviews, the Brandons, the Ruskins, all have incredible histories in and of themselves. But we've added new nodes. Carrollwood can be considered a node. But additionally, some of the things that you're talking about now, such as the IP district is a node, the West Shore is a node inside the city. We're sitting in a huge node. Downtown is a node. And as we think about these nodes, they themselves have their own characteristics. They internally have mechanisms that function either as economic centers, but it is important to understand these because as we work on community plans, as we work on all of those different pieces, we begin to understand the granularity that these nodes have. So the next slide will be about some of those things that we're hearing that apply to nodes, corridors, and preservation. The preservation piece is the part in the middle that isn't a line or a dot. It really does address some of the rural characteristics. It addresses those issues that have been important to you. It addresses the issues that have been important to you in protecting ELAP and wildlife corridors. And again, wildlife corridors are corridors themselves as well. So we've kind of put this together in corridors, nodes, and environmental and rural preservation.
Yes, we're back on here. And we have taken even more of the things that we've heard from you all, more specific geographical areas that you were interested in, or more specific issues like septic tanks in the rural area, and tried to group them into these concepts of corridors, nodes, and environmental and rural preservation. Many of these interrelate, and so it's not that something that's related to bicycle and pedestrian safety only happens on corridors. It happens in nodes and it happens in our rural area too. So many of these cross across the different areas. But I won't read them all out to you. One of the questions that we're going to ask at the conclusion of our presentation is there anything that you all want to add to the list that we've shown of the different things that we've heard from you all, whether they be big things or very specific things?
And I think to highlight Melissa's point about the corridors and the nodes aren't separate and the rural isn't separate, they all relate. I spoke to the IOC on Monday night about the transit surtax, and one of the things that I think is important to understand is that any revenue that comes to us for transportation is really transforming our communities. That's what it's giving us an opportunity to do. So if we think about it just about building sidewalks, we don't really understand what it does to create communities and impact connectivity within some of the communities. It really is transformational, and I think Melissa and I have been here long enough to see that we are on the cusp of becoming a very mature community. We're moving out of adolescence, we're doing redevelopment and new development all at the same time, and managing a lot of different issues all at once. And I think it takes that kind of maturity that we're approaching now to address the issues that we have before us. One of the pieces that is included in your backup, and it is in the right place in the book, looks like this. It's called Project Briefs. And these are project briefs. These are projects that have been undertaken either sequentially, starting with the Planning Commission, moving into some of the regulatory operational environments, or they went from operational to policy. But I think the one thing that's important to stress here is that it's neither an either or. It's not about just the comp plan or just county staff. It's not about Melissa doing stuff or our staff doing stuff. It really does. It's a continuum of things that move across policy to implementation. And I think the more we sit together, and as Melissa will talk about a project, One Water, it really is the understanding of staff at the operational level, what policy implications are, and vice versa. So we'll want to touch upon those. But this is available for you to either follow along the project briefs. I will just focus on the slide in front of us and talk a little bit about a couple of these projects. The 131st, 19th, and Big Bend. I'm going to talk about those together because in your backup you'll have something. Our board has been really encouraging us to look at land use and transportation together. And so when we talk about corridors, what's really important to understand is what is happening on those corridors. They're not all created equally, and not all corridors are the same all the way through. 131st is a really good example of something that started initially as a road widening. We were asked to widen 131st to look at it as an alternative entrance to the university. And as we began to layer on this analysis of, but what is really happening on the ground? What are the pieces that are occurring that are shaping what this corridor should look like? And as we looked at that, there are connections to UACDC, to 22nd Street. There are pieces of the corridor that are built up against the right against the right-of-way that have no room for improvement along the Veterans. And
Sorry.
Good. It's okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
I'm going to stay on this side of the German nation.
I moved yesterday on purpose.
I-
Okay.
Go ahead.
Thank you. So the point being is that there's information and data that comes out of granular analysis. And 131st will be a really good example, and that's included in that book and in the backup that we've provided. We're doing the same as we look at the future of 19th Avenue and what would 19th look like. It's important to understand that as well. And then Big Bend becomes a really important component in how are we looking at mobility and land use together in that corridor. An example of how mobility and land use came together is an analysis that was done on 42nd and 46th north of the university, where we thought 42nd Street was going to be the vehicular-focused roadway, when indeed we did the analysis. We learned that indeed there is room for 46 to be the corridor and for cars, and really focusing 42nd on pedestrian traffic. So that's just to give you a little bit of insight of how we're relooking at some of those things. And we think those relate to your points that you've raised earlier about connectivity. They relate to pieces of land use and transportation coming together. So I will now turn off to Melissa to talk about a couple of other pieces.
Great, thank you. So the next project I want to mention is the Brandon Corridors and Nodes project. This is something that we undertook with the county and the MPO to look at where the opportunities to improve the connectivity in the Brandon area were, as well as opportunities for redevelopment and shaping some of the existing development to be more walkable, more community friendly. And this has moved beyond just a comprehensive plan level study. Now the county is working to look at how to focus that growth in the opportunities, the areas we had initially identified up around the hospital and the Brandon Main Street area, and how to really incentivize redevelopment in that area. We have a number of community profiles that are in here that are looking at our community plans. And whereas in the Brandon area, we were sort of looking at how do we implement the community plan through the redevelopment and encouraging their Main Street. In some of the other areas, some pieces have already been put in place, and now the community is looking to see how is that working. And so we recently completed a profile of the Ruskin area that was in your backup, and that took a look at the demographics, the changes in the land use and the transportation in the time since the community plan was adopted, and really sets the groundwork for that community to better understand where does it need to go now. Are there certain programs and incentives that they need to explore? Are there social service issues that need to be tackled, transportation? What needs to come next? And we're just embarking on doing that in Gibsonton.
Melissa, before you go on, I think the other piece about whether we're doing Ruskin or any of the nodes is that as we look at Brandon, for example, out of the work that was done through the Planning Commission and now Deeper Dive, there is an opportunity, especially I'll use Brandon, to start looking at how community facilities begin to play a major role in becoming anchors. And so there's been conversation about citing a new library. Well, a library serves as an iconic civic piece in a community. And so as we dive deeper, we begin to look at how can we bring these community services together? How can we reduce cost? What is the benefit of a live, work, and play place to reducing trip generation on major roads, to creating opportunities where housing affordability can be addressed and folks can live in a community and perhaps walk or ride to work? I think all of those things become really important as we dig into the granularity of it. But it does then have an impact on how we pay for services, where we site our fire stations, where we site our public facilities. And so it becomes a completeness that we begin to look at as part of the community planning that leads to the community development, and that leads to the infrastructure piece and all of the other components that really begin to build complete communities.
So the next project on your list, you're going to get to hear a good bit about the community vulnerability study from Taryn Sabia. But that has been, as Lucia mentioned, a really great partnership between our agency, the county, and EPC, looking at how we can address some of the concerns about sea level rise and our vulnerability to storms. And those have implications for the comprehensive plan, the land development code, many of our emergency management documents. The next item on the list is the East Rural Agricultural Reserve, and that was an assessment that was conducted to look at how well our rural policies have been doing, with a focus on the eastern portion of Hillsborough County, and looking at the changes in the agricultural community. Are we seeing a lot of plan amendments or other changes that are changing the complexion of the rural area? The Fowler Avenue land use study was something that we undertook in conjunction with the unincorporated area, the city of Tampa, city of Temple Terrace, looking at that corridor that really goes through all three jurisdictions and has a vision from the IP group and many of the community groups in that area to be something more mixed use, walkable, moving towards a more urban environment. And we need to have our land use and our infrastructure really focus in that direction.
And a key component to connecting the IP district to the rest of the community. It is the major corridor, and so again, an example of corridors aren't independent, they're connecting something together.
Yeah, and I think you'll see how this is all connecting if, for those of you who are on the MPO and the draft LRTP, it's being proposed that the Fowler Corridor actually be considered for a road diet, so to speak, and reduce the lanes there based on the vision that is being articulated by the community and looked at through this study. We've been working with HART and the city and the county on a transit-oriented development grant that HART received, looking at the opportunities to along the streetcar extension and the potential BRT along Florida, Nebraska, out to the Fowler Corridor to implement some of the policies in our comprehensive plans about transit-oriented development, look and see how those would work in real life and apply that on the ground, and then see how do we maybe need to calibrate those to make them work better. Also look at issues of zoning and other infrastructure that is needed to support that kind of rapid transit.
But I think, Melissa, that's a really good piece when we talk about nodes. A number of you expressed an interest in transit-oriented development, and that's what it is. That's a node that's connected by corridors of transit, whether it be bus, rail, or other alternatives. So I think transit-oriented development becomes a key piece of the nodal discussion. The next one is the I-4 corridor, and that one has been really since the Urban Land Institute came in, there hasn't been much activity on the I-4 corridor, but that has been a conversation that's been around for a number of years. So it is a piece, again, it's a corridor connecting much more regional uses, moving from Tampa through the county, Plant City, onto Lakeland, and then to Orlando and Daytona. But the I-4 corridor does serve an incredibly regional purpose, and so there's opportunities, and how does that corridor work, and where Plant City, I think, has undertaken that Northwest plan and is focused really creating a node around the Plant City piece of I-4. The next one that is underway is the Lithia, Pinecrest, and Gibsonton shed analysis. And again, there's been a lot of conversation about Lithia. Do we build it? Do we widen it? Do we not widen it? What does it do? I think to really understand what happens in Lithia, I think there's a need to understand some of the dynamics, where a car is moving, how does it relate to the bigger shed? And so the graphic that you have before you is really indicative of how we're starting to look at things differently, not just stretching the, John Lyons used to say, engineers just like to stretch the rubber band and see how to widen the road, but really we like to see a whole lot more of what's happening around those corridors. And so Lithia was a project approved by this board in the initial $812 million program, and is being reviewed now to see what the dynamics are around the Lithia and Gibsonton areas.
Commissioner Smith and Commissioner White are participating in the Little Manatee Working Group, and we've been supporting that group with different data and information to help in their discussions, looking at what the long-term, like 50-year beyond type of plan might be for that area. That community plan contemplated doing that, and having a lot of discussion on that topic in that context. The One Water project is a truly collaborative effort between Planning Commission staff, staff of public utilities, staff of public works, development services, looking at water as a system as opposed to wastewater in one column, stormwater in another column, potable water. That's how our comprehensive plan today breaks them down. They're all separate elements, and this is looking at how do we bring that all together as one system, and look at then, when we're looking at it as one system, there's a lot of opportunities for taking some more innovative approaches to how we plan for our water resources in a sustainable way going forward.
But Melissa, I think the other thing about the One Water work is what it's leading to is the update of the comprehensive plan. And so there, as Melissa said, 3 separate elements in the comp plan right now, and understanding how water works as one piece then becomes really important in the comp plan update.
Yeah, and it's become an opportunity for us to look at how we format the plan in a more user-friendly way so that people can understand what our goals are and what we're trying to achieve. And the plan right now is voluminous, and there's opportunities to say what it is that we're trying to achieve in a more streamlined fashion. The other thing that I think has been really interesting about the One Water project has been the opportunity for our staff to really, the Planning Commission staff, to really learn from the folks who are on the ground doing the operations. And that is really shaping better policy, because we're understanding what some of their constraints are, what the technical ramifications are, that as comprehensive planners, we're not the experts on that. They are. And we're all sitting in the room together, and that shapes better policy. It will then, the policy will then in turn inform updates to the land development code and technical manuals, so that that all hopefully comes together.
Consequently, we are also, on the operations side, understanding a whole lot better about the implications of where we put water and sewer, how we convert septic to sewer, and how that what the implications are to growth as well. So it works both ways.
Yes. The RP2 land use study, you all have been discussing and discussing the opportunity for a moratorium to give us time to look at how we reshape that category. The schools planning study has been our work trying to bring all 4 local governments and the school board together. We've had one meeting and I think are working on scheduling a second one to give you all the opportunity to have more discussion about some of the school planning issues to shape what we need to do going forward in that regard, in terms of maybe changing policy or our interlocal agreements on how we site and plan for schools.
And Commissioner, I promised you 9:30. I'm thinking we're 2 minutes away. The South County Integrated Mobility Study was brought to you before. Cutter did some work looking at how people move in South County, and I know there were some questions about the data, et cetera, but it begins to peel away the onion of what are those pieces that, where are those pieces where we can find alternative ways to connect communities. So it then will lead to actually trail implementation, because the two together are, how do people move at the macro level? How do they move at the micro level? Is there something in the way that's keeping them from getting to their grocery store that just might be as far as Commissioner Miller is from me, but there's no road, there's no bike path, there's no anything. So what are the ways to avoid a big loop and make those connections? But it is a major piece of analytical work that then will lead us to understanding how we can do better connectivity and better community building. So that, and the other piece then was the trail implementation. There's a link to a website which our staff has prepared that really does begin to show you how all those trail components begin working together, and thinking about trails not just as recreational opportunities, but really as opportunities to connect to roadways. When we do roadway design now, so we are working on Van Dyke, and Van Dyke will have not just a bike trail on the portion of Van Dyke going east-west, but it will connect onto the Upper Tampa Bay Trail to make those connections. And Melissa?
And the Waimama Village too, I know you all have been having a lot of discussion in your land use meetings about that, and we are working to look at that land use category and also the opportunities to work with the Waimama Now and Enterprising Latinas and the Community Development Corporation there to update the community plan as needed to help them realize their goals for revitalizing downtown Waimama.
So while we haven't explicitly tagged each project to each one of the things on your list of corridors, nodes, and environmental land, we are addressing them. And to the extent that you can provide additional information for us of how that might work, we're here today to hear that. That really is our desire, is to get input and insight from you. So with that, I think we are closed and open and available.
Okay, great duo. Thank you very, very much. Now we're moving to next steps. That was fantastic. I really do appreciate your presentation. We're going to move to the next steps now. Commissioner Hagan, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I know I have a tight window here, so I'm going to keep my remarks brief. In the past, it's been my impression that well, first of all, I want to say it was a great presentation, extremely thorough. But it's been my impression in the past that we have a tendency to focus more on residential and how and where we want growth to occur. While certainly important, for over 10 years, I've focused more on job creation and growing our economy. And this goes back to when I chaired the Economic Stimulus Task Force. I believe that was in 2008. And in 2010, when I championed the ad valorem exemption program, that's been a powerful tool in our corporate recruitment efforts. So my number one concern is to ensure that we can sustain job and economic growth in Hillsborough County. We all know that growth is imminent. We know the numbers the Planning Commission and ULI have described. The Planning Commission is, I believe it's a 400,000 figure number. ULI stated expectation of 1,700 people a month expected to move here. And as an aside, I'm talking about job creation, but this is also an affordable housing issue, and that citizens need good-paying jobs to be available. But there are two areas that I want staff to focus on and to bring back the necessary information for us to consider. One is to increase our inventory of competitive sites. I've worked with the EDC for years, and I can tell you that we've struggled with this issue for a long time. This is critically important in that we must have a healthy inventory in order to attract economic development and ensure adequate sites for job creation in the future. And our inventory is dwindling. If my numbers are correct, last year alone, we lost 24% of our inventory. According to ULI, over the next 20 years, we'll need 7,000 acres to accommodate 100 million square feet of office space and industrial needs. Well, the remaining sites that we have the potential to develop 4.4 million square feet of office space and 11.8 million of industrial space for a total of 15.8 million of the needed 100 million square feet. Again, these aren't my numbers, these are ULI's numbers. The next area that can help us to increase our competitive sites inventory, and that involves developing along the I-4 corridor. And we have that was mentioned in one of your bullet points. As Lucia stated, this has been studied for an extremely long time. I can go back to 2010 when we considered a green tech corridor that was ultimately shot down by this board 4-3. We also had the ULI study in 2017. I-4 has a lot of potential and is a prime location for competitive site selection. A couple of points. The I-4 corridor has been identified as one of the hottest industrial markets in the nation, with the need to accommodate e-commerce operations for various companies. There have been several major industrial developments along I-4, but this investment is being steered to Polk County across the county line. CoStar reported recently there's more speculative space under construction now than in the past 15 years, but again, majority of this is occurring in eastern Hillsborough County, Plant City, and Polk along I-4. Collier's named our market one of the top 10 hottest industrial markets in the United States. So it's clear that the time is right for us to capitalize on the hot market and allow development along the I-4 corridor and not to lose another multi-million-dollar job-generating deal to Polk or to Lakeland. Lucia referenced a node approach. Again, the ULI study said there are economic opportunities in I-4 and recommended taking this economic node approach. For example, you have I-4, I-75, McIntosh and I-4, and I-4 and 579. I believe that we need to invest in infrastructure here at these nodes, and I'd like for staff to bring back some information in that area as well. I do want to be clear that we should keep our rural areas rural, but in the process, let's not stifle or prevent job creation and economic development. We need to be strategic with our economic development planning and be smart and carefully plan for economic development and growth. So I guess for the purpose of today, big picture, sustaining job and economic growth throughout Hillsborough County, but more specifically, consider a node approach along I-4, including the necessary infrastructure to encourage and facilitate economic development, and then to increase our inventory of competitive sites. So those are a couple of issues that I jotted down, and we may have a couple more as we move on here, but
Thank you, thank you, Mr. Hagan. Well put. Commissioner Merman, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a couple of questions before some comments. 131st Avenue. I remember when this first came up, Commissioner Crest was the cheerleader for that. I think Commissioner Miller probably remembers this. And the administration at USF wasn't in total agreement with that corridor. Is that still the case? Or because there isn't immediate access off 275. And I was wondering, are we putting a lot of time and effort in there with realizing, I mean, is USF, are they on board with that being a corridor into their campus?
So a lot of work has been done with USF and with the UACDC about that corridor. And so as we looked at it, it doesn't necessarily just provide an entrance to USF, but it really begins to serve as a community main street, east-west Main Street. If 22nd is the sort of the major corridor in that area, the north-south one, 131st begins to serve an east-west component. And so the importance of, and we talk about complete streets, and if there's ever been an example of where we can really add multimodal access for pedestrians and bicyclists, and if you've been in that area for wheelchairs, people move around in wheelchairs, and many may be disabled. And so it's, as we looked at it, it became less of a gateway into USF and more of a community connector, creating the east-west spine in the UACDC area. And our folks have worked with Sarah Combs on this project, and so I think there's a lot of support for it in that vein in creating what would be the east-west piece partner to the 22nd Street North-South corridor.
Okay, so that's the only thing, because I haven't heard much about it until you just mentioned it in this report. And I just wanted to make sure that USF was on board, because originally at the beginning they weren't.
And so, interesting, Melissa just reminded me, it's not so it started as a widening conversation. It's not a widening anymore.
Oh,
and
okay.
So, and that's really what happened. But it happened because of that granular deep dive into how and where people are moving and what's on the ground.
Okay. Well, this is, of course, not my district, but I know there were some concerns back then.
Well, Commissioner Merman, if you remember, I was not all in favor of that. Commissioner Crest's idea of widening 131st Street because it made no sense to me whatsoever.
Right.
However, since that time, staff has been working with not only University CDC, Veterans Hospital, of course, is expanding, and coming down Bruce B. Downs, trying to get into the Veterans Hospital, sometimes you take your life in your own hands.
Yes, you do.
Coming down 131st, where I think they have an interest now going into the Veterans Hospital, helps that area. So even though I was not jumping up and down about it when it first happened, as that area continues to grow and develop, I can see the need for that. It's not a widening anymore. It's a necessity that they're looking at going north and going east and west, taking some of the load off of 22nd Street and really off of Fowler and Fletcher.
Good. Okay, great. Great presentation today, as Commissioner Hagan says, very thorough, and of course I agree with all of his points. And y'all remember this, Commissioner Miller and I chaired this, the economic press. We did this as a blueprint, and every single thing practically that we've been talking about is in here. But if we go back to it, like you call them nodes now, but they're economic development areas. That's what we call them in the Prosperity Committee. And actually, they talked about the history. Y'all should really go back and reread this, because it talks about, how our historical approach to economic growth relied on, the premises of build where you had available land, and affordable land would fuel economic growth. And they were policies that really weren't sustainable. So that's why the committee came up with the economic development areas to help to really bring workforce and land use and transportation all together in one spot, which really made sense. And that the EDAs would be focused on, job attraction that our county residents were being trained for or were educated for, like, financial services and different things like that. So, I mean, it goes through, the recommendations were pretty clear about creating economic development areas. And I know we had a workshop, Ron Barton took us through a workshop where we actually defined the nodes and where they are. There were 4 or 5 of them. I can't really remember. But I think I'm not sure we have to really reinvent the whole wheel here because we have information that we've been accumulating. And I think now there's interest to really act on it and activate it. But I think the one thing that came in here was the policies of the economic development areas. And it was, of course, preserving rural lands, promoting redevelopment of areas, but also to create those incentives for the development in those areas. And I think that that was something that we just haven't really done to try and steer everything to certain areas so that we can enjoy the fruits of our labor, like, you know, transportation and connectivity, all the stuff that we talk about here at this board. But I just wanted to bring that up. I think it's really important that we look at those and look at creating and having those incentives available for those developers and going back to those economic development areas that we already identified and see, okay, what are next steps? And those things you already laid out, how do they fit into those areas? Brandon was a huge area. It was more of a redevelopment area, but it was, you know, that area is so ripe over there where USAA is and a lot of those different. So that's just a couple comments I had. But I do want to go back to comments I've made previously about creating a robust communications plan and getting feedback from our county citizens about what they would really like to see us do. I think when the RP2 moratorium came up, that's what I want to hear from citizens. What would they like to see? You know, and I mean, we've heard brought from one end to the other. People have said, no, stop. Other end of the spectrum, you know, and then in the middle, the private property rights guy. And then you've got, you know, well, we need jobs down here. And so, you know, it covers a lot. And I think it's important for us to hear from that. And the whole point is to getting people to participate, you know, in this survey and on their terms and what they could do. So I think the outreach will have a lot of success with our future land use policies. And I'd like to really see our board make a strong commitment to this strategy. So I'd like to ask the Planning Commission staff really to do a community engagement outreach plan for proposed and any future land use changes or comp plan revisions. And actually that Prosperity Committee report recommended revisions to the comp plan. So, and that to achieve a goal of, and I'm just listing a few things to include: community-wide survey, the educational materials about the history of development, identifying key audiences, undertaking market research, including focus groups, organized community meetings, creating online digital engagement. I think that's always important for people because that seems to be a lot of people get home and they have to take care of their families, but they can go on their computer and participate online. But I think that again, the goal would be so that we understand, the community, our citizens understand growth patterns and development options that make sense for us as we discuss future development and what's best for Hillsborough County and what kind of, if we're going to make these changes, they need to be sustainable and last for 10 to 20 years, not just 3 years down the road. I'd like, hopefully you could do it in 6 months and come back to the board by the second meeting in December with your scope of what you'd like to, of how you'd like to really move forward on this process for a public outreach plan. So that's my action point today to direct staff to do that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner Merman. Before I call on Commissioner Overman, let me piggyback on what Commissioner Merman said. I think we need to do exactly that. I think we need to get out to the community, to the citizens of this county, hear what they have to say. You know, we hear from a certain segment about what they want, But I don't think that's everyone that's out in this community saying what they have to say. Some people just don't communicate with us about what they feel, how this county should grow, or how smart growth should take place. So I believe we need to get out there and find out exactly what's going on. If we have to spend a little money to make sure we have every nook and cranny of this county having some type of public meeting to find out what they have to say and what they need, I think that's something that we should do. Also, while you're doing that, I would like to see population projections. I know we talk about 2045 being what we look at. I think we need to look at 10 years from now. Where are we population-wise 10 years from now? What do you project those population growths to be? I think that plays a major role in what our development needs to look at. If we don't start looking at 10 years, 15 years, and start looking at 25, 30, 40 years, we're in trouble. We can't stop them from coming. We're not going to build a wall around this county. They're going to come. People are coming to this county because of the mere fact is how great Hillsborough County is. So I think we just look at population growth 10 years out. And instead of looking, I know we did look at it 2045, that's a plan that we have, but start looking at least 10 years out of where we're going. Specifically, let's look at having those meetings out in the community, out in this county, in every nook and cranny we can, east, north, west, south, and what they would like to see us have, instead of those that email us all the time and say what they don't want to see us have. Commissioner Overman, you recognize.
Thank you, Chair. I like what I'm hearing so far. This is a good conversation and terrific job of pulling together a massive amount of work that you're already in play, and that's terrific. One of the things that I saw on the list of the things that we said that got my attention, obviously, it's all about what I thought was important. So, but affordable housing is clearly the choices on urban and rural. Equity is a big deal. Where we invest, how we grow, and how we address communities as a whole. And when it comes to the various different economic spectrums within our community, I think is critically important, and it's good to see it there. The idea of economic growth and economic development ties together a series of things that we've heard over the last year or so in terms of workshops and prior to now, where we've addressed issues such as opportunity zones, TDRs, inclusionary zones, TIFs, tax incremental funding, community redevelopment areas, CDDs. All of these are tools that we use to craft and grow and to incentivize development in the right places for the right reasons. They address the economics, prosperity goals in terms of where do we want not only people to live, but also work and play. And to do that, we have to decide really in your concepts of corridor nodes and corridor preservation. A critical element to that we've started, and we've started adopting the policies when it comes to road design, but we don't really have a plan for how we identify, or at least I haven't seen it yet, how we identify, how we achieve people getting around to those economic opportunities and how communities grow as it pertains to Vision Zero, by recognizing that people are going to go like water flows. If they can get there, they're going to go that way. But we haven't identified the best way to get people between those nodes in the multiple ways that we've done it. Commissioner Miller, you mentioned that we've been doing we need to do surveys, and we have been doing surveys as it pertains to transportation options through the MPO's work. And the fact that we're planning to 2045 is driven by our funding for transportation, not by our needs when it comes to economic growth. So this second set of surveying and talking and including our communities of what we're hearing via the 2,500 emails that I get, seems like each month, on what's going on in various different communities, on how things are growing. I think if we attempt to develop a Vision Zero map, Orlando actually went through this process recently where in their efforts to address their needs and adoption of Vision Zero, coordinated that with their corridor preservation plans, identify different levels of ways and prioritize different levels of ways that people get around. And where there are corridors that are more car-centric and corridors that are more people-centric. And, you know, we've been focusing on trails, which is terrific, but we can't do that to the exclusion of everything else. So really looking at ways that we tie in our economic analysis and growth plans with what our comp plan goals are and our land use and incentive plans. TDRs is critically, transfer of development rights is critical to our agricultural communities. It is the basis of their economic viability. And if we just say we're not going to grow in certain areas and put them at risk, we jeopardize a major economic engine within Hillsborough County. And so it's important that if we develop a strategy to keep rural, we don't strip their economic viability in the process. So using various different tools, financial tools or zoning tools or land rights tools to incentivize where we want growth and yet still create the value of having that agricultural land, those rural lands, those conservation lands, and those ELAP lands that are so important to our sustainability long term and to our economic engine is critical a part of this process. And I think that may be an area that hasn't necessarily been completely addressed. And that's because not everybody thinks about that when they're making dinner for their kids at night. You know, they're just not. We're trying to figure out, how do I get out of this subdevelopment that I live in, that I moved to, which was rural and is no longer. So I think that's a very important part, and you've got the elements of it in many of the items that you've recognized. But I think it's critical going forward that we develop a means of having this conversation by possibly conducting a forum of the professionals that we've tapped in the past, or those that we haven't tapped yet. For example, Bo Kemp is working on in the university area, and he has experience not only in community building but in opportunity zones and TODs and you know, on transportation issues. And I mean, he's a great resource to have on a forum, maybe with somebody like Margaret Kubelin, who's now with FDOT, did the Vision 00 series for Orlando. Or who else was I thinking of? Smart Growth America has a great team of people that had a forum recently on opportunity zones, financing for affordable housing, how it ties to transit. So Calvin Gladney is the CEO there. He's a terrific resource to open up the dialogue with folks like Van Linkus, who came to talk to us about transfer of development rights. I'm not suggesting we hire these professionals, but I'm suggesting that bringing them to the table maybe in a forum format with us so we can talk about how all those pieces fit together. Because we're doing the work. You could see by this not even complete, I'm sure, a massive list of projects that we've got in the queue. But without pulling them all together and making sure we as folks that are creating laws and ordinance and opportunities, you know, understand how it all fits together in a dialogue fashion, we may be able to get a little further down the road than we've attempted to over the years, just as a next step to consider. Because we've had, like for example, the meeting with the school board. We're all in a line, and we had a presentation, and that was it. There was little dialogue of how that works out. So it may need to be something more of not necessarily a 2-hour workshop, but you know, somewhere where we really sit down and kind of ferret out with the professionals who do this every day, along with our staff that do this every day, and help us as politicians and leaders and lawmakers or legislators understand what the professionals are helping us guide the community in a helpful, productive way. Because the workshop that we had, for example, with the MPO and Hart, where the consultant went through the process of explaining the financing process of maximizing the opportunity for funding, then how long it took was not only eye-opening, but he clearly, in his presentation, made it obvious that the county's not at the table, really. He indicated at the end of the presentation, well, in order to get the best bonus points for funding on a transportation-related project, that it was clear that the issues associated with merit in that application process required that we had a comprehensive plan in affordable housing and addressing the needs of transit-dependent communities. Well, we've done that in different areas, but we don't have a comprehensive, that's not necessarily, in my opinion, from what I've been able to see, part of our land use. It's not part of our code and our zoning. And it could be, and it shall be, but going forward. But without those, what I call bonus points, in our application for maximizing the funding for the deficit that we're trying to address in transit, we won't get that grant. We won't speak in one voice. We won't get the funding. And I think that we have an opportunity now to move that needle forward through this process so that we can actually maximize the use of opportunities, grants, and resources, both at the state and the federal level, along with the commitment this board has made towards, and our citizens in terms of the Surtax, in terms of helping people not only get around, but live, work, and play in communities they want to live in and have good jobs along the way. So those are some of the things that I'd like to see us sort of as next steps. So there's a greater dialogue, and I'll stop now.
Thank you. Commissioner Kemp, you recognized.
Thank you. I remember back to the days when they would throw those rubber tubes along the road, do a traffic count, and then they widen it based on that. I mean, that seemed to be all that mattered, the context of the road, nothing else. And we've come from that, but we need to go further. I don't think we've done the greatest job, as I've said many times before. I don't think the development has been context sensitive at all in many, many ways. And I think we have to really change. And I know that this is a lot of what I've seen today is an effort to really work that in. I do think everything we're talking about is about economic prosperity. And also in terms of population growth, which I know keeps getting brought up. Yes, people are coming. But part of our population growth is public policy. Part of our population growth is what we decide to do in terms of what we're allowing in building, how we're allowing in building, and the jobs that we create. People are not going to stay here in tents with no jobs. So that is part of it. And part of it is what we decide here as we move forward. Just in terms of highlighting a few things that are out there, I think for me, one of the most important things, as I've stated before, we had it up there in a way, but I really want to see growth as much as possible. I don't believe will ever be 100%, but we are so far from that. Growth paying its own way. We have really got to look at our impact fees. We've still done very little about that over the past year. And we have to, I've been looking at what other counties are doing. Other counties for the last 2 decades or more have had impact fees in law enforcement to pay for their sheriff stations and jails, government buildings to pay for their government infrastructure, in libraries. Our parks are still miserably low. We've done a little bit in getting up our fire, but we're still not there with our mobility. And very importantly, because as we talk about not building in the rural service area and doing infill and redevelopment, which is what we have to do if we're going to change Hillsborough County, and that's all about transit-oriented development. But to get that infrastructure in place, we're really going to have to look at our water and wastewater system. And that in the university area, I just find it shocking sometimes that in our very dense, populated areas that we don't have, that we're still on septic there. So that's really important, but also important is how we pay for it. I've recently found out that I guess we're the only county around that's forwarding a loan basically to developers, putting a impact fee assessment on the houses for water and wastewater. That has to change, and I wouldn't support any increase in any kind of wastewater or water fees on our community until we end that, because we're putting forward hundreds of millions of dollars on our enterprise system, on our regular payers, instead of gathering that money to do what we have to do for a really important infrastructure. We don't see it, but it is really constraining us from economic development and prosperity as far as I'm concerned. I'd like to make sure that we have all our main buildings that the county funds. Anything that the county is responsible for really needs to be thought about as being part of creating a node, or part of, I guess I don't like the word node, actually. I'd rather say economic centers. Nodes always sound like a negative thing to me, honestly. I don't know if that's the adopted language now, but they also have something that you're not sure what it is, but I appreciate the definitions. But I'd like to see these buildings, our libraries, our service centers, our whatever we do needs to be part, I think, of a identified center, economic center in a place. I'd like to add to the list net zero, looking at for all of our buildings that we do in the county, at least, looking at how close we can get to net zero, having water collection also, and starting a big water collection program and looking at that for our big buildings in terms of anything we do with landscaping. Corridor preservation, oh my God, I feel like I don't know anything about what we've done, but I feel like I really want us to get corridor preservation, because I think one of the issues that we have is the lack of grid. I mean, in Brandon, I think it's created a nightmare. The way new development has gone over the last 30 years has been lacking that kind of connectivity or even a potential for that. So I think we have to get back to grid, and that has to be with corridor preservation. I think it's good to focus on, like you're doing, like pulling out these areas that I know, Lucia, you called it granular or local. I think that's the only way. You really have to look at that center and look at how to infuse that or set up the predicate for allowing that to become transit-oriented development, densify, work it out for, as you said, live, work, or play. People work, be able to go to their grocery stores, whatever, in those areas. That's the only way that we're going to be reducing our traffic. I think we have to have an overall goal of reducing single car use, single vehicle use, because until we have that, or look at that with every decision we make, otherwise we cannot build our way out of congestion or development. And then I just like to, and I like focusing on Gibsonton, Ruskin, Waimama, University area, Brandon. I mean, I think that's what we have to do. Town and country, where I think the library and the service center there was put in a really good place with a good thought. And maybe we can think about how to, make that happen a little more aggressively. I'm not sure how that works. I'd also like to just address Commissioner Hagan and the ULI, the I-4 development, which I know has been floating around forever. But I will say that I would like to have a presentation. I've been here for 3 years. I've never seen a presentation on our economic development strategies and goals. I worry that it's too much focused on warehousing. And even if you dress it up and say e-commerce operations, you're still using big spaces, lots of roadway for low-wage jobs. And I'm not sure that that's the direction we want to go in, if that's the need, because we do have a lot of low-wage jobs. maybe those are things that are better suited if Pasco or Polk County wants that kind of development. But I'd like to see an analysis of that, because if that's what we should be doing, then I'll go for it. If that's helping to build prosperity, but I'm not sure that is, and I'm not sure in terms of when we do job development, economic development. I mean, we want the central operations. We want the headquarters. We want the new growth of our local companies, rather than necessarily having a lot of square footage in warehousing operations. Just saying, I'm not sure. I'm not an economic analysis, but I really think it's something that I would like to understand more about and see some analysis of, because I'm not sure that's, I don't know what direction we're going in, and I'm not sure that's the direction, if it is, brings us the greatest prosperity.
Commissioner Smith, you recognize.
Thank you. And thanks for this presentation, very, very meaty. Thanks for all the comments by the commissioners, and everybody's been doing their homework, I could see, and really appreciate the concise, bullet-pointed comments from the commissioners. Commissioner Kemp, that was a lot in one small bit, and I agree with every bit of it. I also agree with Commissioner Hagan's emphasis on, pointing out that we need to emphasize commercial space while we're preserving rural areas and preserving environmental areas, preserving agriculture in our county. We also need to be preserving commercial office and industrial. And as a citizen, I have come before this board several times over the years and asked, sometimes just because the market happens to be hot for residential, don't convert that commercial to residential. Preserve it when we can, where we can, in big enough spaces that it can really be used for industrial parks and office parks. I don't know if you remember, I was on that economic prosperity stakeholder committee.
We remember.
That's right, I'm a stakeholder. And voiced concerns similar to Commissioner Kemp just raising about the, needing to diversify our economic base. So it's not just home builders that are susceptible to those market up and downs, and not just the warehouses, but that we preserve agriculture, which is a huge economic engine, and look at other commercial opportunities and jobs in our nodes. As far as this presentation today, the missing pieces on slide 3 and 5, I really would like to see, talking about what our citizens outreach, what we're hearing from the citizens, it's transportation. I mean, it's affordable housing, and it's transportation and congestion. People are just getting increasingly frustrated with our county's planning, growth management and what they're saying to us is, you need to be providing infrastructure at the same time. You're lowering our quality of life. And so I think it's important to have that. I know the slide with the corridors is all about transportation, but in the what we heard slide number 3, I think transportation, congestion, transit opportunities, transportation options is top of the list of what we're hearing from the citizens. Reducing congestion and the timing of what people are telling us, the timing of growth and infrastructure has to happen together. And are you looking at a place where you have it on there?
No, we're just looking to see how we merge.
Yeah, and how we're paying for it. This is the other piece that we're hearing from the citizens is, and so many citizens say, why don't you just charge the development to cover the cost? Well, we know it's it's not that simple, it's complicated, but that's a key piece that has to be in what's important to us. Yes, I am all about reaching out to the citizens, and I understand that there are different stakeholders and different perspectives, and we're not ever going to get everybody to agree. But the one thing everybody agrees on is we need to fix traffic, and we need to stop putting too much traffic on the roads before we are fixing that. We have to stop lowering the quality of life and start raising the quality of life. The first land use workshop that we had, I was showing everybody something that had come in a little South County newspaper, not even the Observer, but something, Sun City Center paper. The journalist had gone out and counted up all the housing that was already baked in, that had recently been approved around 301 and 674, and it was 13,225 houses coming to that area, 674 and 301. 2 days ago, I came across this advertisement for a new shopping center at, and I only got it too late to distribute 48 hours ahead of this, so I will send it out to everybody after this as a memo. But this advertisement is saying that this shopping center that's coming, the Belmont Shopping Center at 301 and Baum Road, they've added up 22,000 plus houses within 3 miles of that. And their diagram is not even counting Sun City Center, Ruskin, or Apollo Beach. 22,000 houses that build out at Baum Road and 301. The first workshop, when I said about the 13,000 houses, I said, I want to see what is coming, what's already baked in. And what was brought to us in the second workshop was the acreage. The acreage and the population projections and the acreage. But I think it's important that we look at the actual housing and the number of people that we're already bringing online and the number of cars that we're already bringing online. I mean, things are going to get worse before they get better. And we are going to have to address that and really step up how we make all these plans and visions work.
Commissioner Smith, we're on a time frame here. Come on.
Yes, I know, but just because I'm late, I'm the last one, doesn't mean I get less time than everyone else got, and I'm almost there. If you were to listen back to this workshop and your presentation, you would hear a lot about plans and studies and assessments, and you would hear the term looking at, what we're looking at, over and over, and we're looking at, and we're looking at, and we've got a lot of these plans and studies. Great work, but now the looking part is going really well, and the doing part has to start. And so we need to start making these plans and studies, start directing growth to achieve this list of goals and visions that we have. And our planners need to start using these plans and studies and visions to in their recommendations to us of what we should approve where. And I see that beginning to happen. I see that our planners are starting to really insist on the grid that we have all been talking about, and holding a harder line with as they review development coming, making sure there's stub outs that are going to connect, making sure there's sidewalks, and so I see that happening, but I'm saying that it needs to happen more and more. We need to really be making as the rubber hits the road, and so our decisions here have to reflect these plans and studies. We have to update our comp plan. We're 10 years behind. as that was discussed in the Economic Prosperity Committee back then. We have to change land development code to implement comprehensive plan to reflect all these studies and visions and looking at. And we have to revise our transportation technical manual to change and change our policy, not just the manual, but change our policy so we're not allowing the design exceptions over and over that are overloading our roads and allowing substandard roads to continue along with more and more traffic. So that's where I'll end. While we're planning, we need to be doing.
Thank you, ma'am. Ms. Garces, Mrs.
We have completed our piece. I think the next piece is the piece on the vulnerability
Okay.
component.
All right, thank you very much.
And
Ms. Zabia
you want to introduce her?
and Mr. Cook.
Okay.
Yes,
I'm
we're
sorry.
thrilled. No, I just was going to introduce
Go ahead,
Taryn
go ahead.
Sabia and Brian Cook with the Florida Center for Community Design and Research. It's a real pleasure to work with them, and this has truly been a partnership. Sean College and Jean Henry, Sean College from the Planning Commission and Jean Henry from the county have been co-project managing this, as this really feeds into a lot of different documents, both from the comp plan and the regulatory side.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning, Commissioners. I'm Taryn Sabia. I'm the Director for the Florida Center for Community Design and Research at USF. And with me is Professor Brian Cook. We are excited to be here this morning, even though we are talking about what you'll see as some very serious and concerning issues. We do see opportunities for us in the future. And just a little bit about the study and overall about the Florida Center. So the Florida Center for Community Design and Research was initially founded by the Florida Legislature in 1986, and we were founded to assist the citizens of Florida in creating more livable and sustainable communities. So we think that that is a really important mission, and we have a partnership with the College of Public Health. They've been instrumental in the study as we have looked at not only built environment issues and ecological issues, but as you'll see, we've looked at population and public health issues as they relate to resiliency and our vulnerabilities to sea level rise and flooding. And the community vulnerability study is what it's being called, and we'll take you through the volumes that have been created, but we really did focus again on a number of water-related issues. And Brian is going to talk to you a little bit about how the study overall is impacting other studies, including the local mitigation strategy, PDRP, and some of the other elements, including the comprehensive plan.
All right. Well, hello. Thanks for having us here. We're so the project we're doing is. Oh, I'll stoop for time's sake here. Okay. So we've been working with the team from planning, but also from emergency management. And at the beginning, the impetus for the project was the perils of flood legislation from 2015. So that required municipalities to address sea level rise towards their comprehensive planning. As we got into the project, and especially with our focus on the community vulnerabilities, and especially because of our collaboration with College of Public Health, we created the name the Community Vulnerability Study. So the Community Vulnerability Study is a thing unto itself, and then that study is then helping us within our work that we're contracted to do is to address the requirements for Perils of Flood Act within the comprehensive plan, but also the local mitigation strategy, especially pertaining to those aspects that deal with flood. So when you look at the perils of flood, there's 6 requirements. The top 3 are things that you actually have to think about and plan for. It takes decision making, so reducing flood risk, removal of coastal property from a flood zone, and reducing losses for flood insurance. These are actual things you have to put planning language into and make decisions about. The bottom 3 are kind of like checking boxes. So construction requirements, saying you'll work with the Florida code. So the bottom three are more checking boxes, and we'll keep it brief for that. Then with the local mitigation strategy, this is about identifying hazards and risks within the county. So there's 20-something of those, and then we are looking at the ones especially related to flood. So our project will feed into those. So as we got started, what we wanted to do was understand, we took a step back actually in the beginning. We were coming at this with a fresh look, and so we want to understand what are the vulnerabilities to flooding. So this is sea level rise, hurricane tidal inundation, rain, it's every form of flooding. So we wanted to understand at the very beginning, what are the vulnerabilities to flood? But then the second part goes into, okay, we're in Hillsborough County, where do these vulnerabilities exist within our region? So that's also on our plate. But then we're not stopping there. This is the fun part, which is thinking about what are we gonna do about it? And I think that's been a fun process, and we're working through that, and I'll explain a little bit more. To be clear, our project is going towards the year 2045. We've aligned that with the MPO study so we could share data and talk and have good conversations about that. We're looking at for our study, when you look at our maps, we're looking at basic levels of sea level rise using the high scenario. Then Category 1 hurricanes, Category 3, and a Category 5, which doesn't really take into account sea level rise because I think it's 42 feet of inundation, and so whether an extra foot or so goes into that, it's not really a big deal. And then the 1% rain event. Okay, so as we started our project, coming at this with a fresh look, we thought it would be great this is all about water, right? So we need to understand the hydrologic systems within Florida specifically. And then, since we are addressing the comprehensive plan requirements, we thought, well, we need to know what other people are doing in terms of their comprehensive planning and compare those different plans. Then we'll take a look at the built environment vulnerabilities. That's something that's more typical maybe, and then also the public health vulnerabilities. So with the hydrology part, I taught a class as a landscape and urbanism class, and so we were looking at with the students both the way water moves through our system, but also the changes in our communities and in our region about the transition of our water system from some system to other systems, especially as we grow and develop.
So this is
All right. So this is where I like to give a little bit of understanding about how I began to understand how water works. So my training is in architecture and urban design, where Brian's training is in landscape architecture and urban ecology, and urban design is where we kind of meet in the middle. So as I was learning a lot about the Florida landscape and how water is impacting the built environment, we came up with this idea about how to describe it to people who are unfamiliar. So Florida really is like a sponge, and if you think about how a sponge looks, it has divots and crevices of different sizes. They hold water, they absorb water, they pull water to the center, and then that water moves to the edges. And that's really how the Florida landscape works. So wherever we shift water or move it to or divert it, it impacts the other areas within the sponge and the coastline as well. So it's all related.
In the same way that a sponge sort of fills and saturates, we're so flat that the water is really reliant on going down and into the soil and then moving through the ground and into our rivers, which is why we have a brown colored river. It's like, I told my students, it's like Earl Grey. It's like tea, it's sifted through the leaves, right? So, okay, after we did this class, one of my students actually said, when we're looking at these assessments, nobody's looking at the ecological impacts due to flood, so we decided to add that to the study. And then another thing going through literature review and that, the governance structures tend to have a very big effect on the way people, what kind of risk develops within a community.
And you'll find as we come back and talk to you later on, one of the reasons that we felt the ecological piece was important is not only for the preservation of it and the natural environment, but also because of the advantage that it may permit for mitigation and risk reduction in the future.
Right. Okay, so this part of the study, I've only been talking about the vulnerabilities so far. So we're calling this volume 1 out of 3. So volume 1 is all about vulnerabilities, and that's what we're here to talk to you about today. We're also looking at, like I said before, mitigation, and that'll include examples and case studies and articles about what to do about all this. And then we did run a studio with 24 interdisciplinary students to make suggestions and proposals about what to do about it.
And those strategies will be put together into a mitigation catalog so that we'll have a catalog of those ideas for Hillsborough.
And then volume 3 will be after working through all these ideas with county staff and agencies and with you all to actually propose what we're going to be doing about it within our own community and putting it into policy.
And those policy recommendations will be formatted within the comprehensive plan, but also some of those other areas that we showed you, including local mitigation strategy and other plans where it's relevant, including land development.
Right, so like I said, this is a study unto itself, and so once complete, it really can go towards other policy such as land development regulations, building codes, infrastructure plans, et cetera. It'll be a resource for everybody to use. So as I said, when we started, we looked at comprehensive plans. So we tried to do this with a lot of our research was to package it in a way that was digestible. So as we started looking at all the other municipalities and how they were addressing comprehensive planning, we put it into a matrix. So the top, you'll see the those are the 6 requirements, and then say this one is Clearwater, for example, and so what are they doing to address those 6 requirements? And so we put that into a big spreadsheet form, and that's available. We also, again, wanting to get the background understanding of these issues, we looked at from the federal level all the way down to the local level, what are the policies and requirements and standards that sort of surround this topic, so we looked at that. And then we also didn't want to reinvent the wheel in terms of understanding the vulnerabilities. And so there actually have been quite a few studies, especially within the last 10 years. So we looked at all those and did the same thing. We started to package those and create short summaries of them. Part of this research, I guess the literature review part, was to look at some of these other case studies. So we have had some devastating events in our recent past. So Hurricane Katrina, Irma, and as we looked at these, the built environment, which is what usually shows up as the main topic on our assessments, is only one of many things that occur during these events, right? So you have very social issues about communities being devastated, about them moving and not coming back. You have different types of people that deal with the event differently. And so as we were going through that, we started our study based on some CDC criteria about social vulnerability. And then we actually have expanded that, and we're going to be writing a paper on that, so that'll be fun. But that set the foundation for how we're studying the social vulnerability of our region.
So based on the research, we expanded what the CDC currently looks at, and it's based on what we have found coming out of some of those more catastrophic events, and we felt that it needed to be expanded. So ultimately what's happening and what we're describing is this process where we've gathered as much information as possible, looked at what other communities around the state, the country, and even the world are doing. And now we feel that we really do have one of the most robust studies that's been done in the state of Florida. And we're grateful to Hillsborough County and the team for allowing us to be able to really push this forward. And we think the community will really benefit in the end because of it.
So all of these different things we said we studied, we really wanted to make that information user-friendly. So everything that we read, we tried to create like a 1 to 3 page summary of. And in doing that, we created what we're calling the Community Vulnerability Handbook. So this is like a big appendix or maybe like a textbook but it has these short summaries so that if you want to understand, say, the role of the community rating system within all of this, there's a short summary of that. Or if you want to know what the local mitigation strategy does and is, there's something for that. And if you want to understand some of the issues with Hurricane Katrina, there are some case studies, examples of those. So those are all packaged into one document, and they're actually on the Hillsborough County website right now. So like I showed you with the matrix, as we combed through all of this, anytime somebody said that something was vulnerable, like the MPO saying, say, on and off ramps were vulnerable in a particular area due to flood, we put that in a matrix. So we have this matrix built up. It's about 15 pages. And that really helped us establish what are the vulnerabilities. And then we took those and we said, okay, where are these things happening in Hillsborough County? So then we made maps. We took all these things from the matrix and made maps of as many of those as we could find.
So these maps are really what took us into creating the assessment. So we came up with that gigantic list of everything that would be vulnerable within the county. And then we mapped them against those scenarios that we described in the beginning, from sea level rise to the Category 1, Category 3, Category 5, and precipitation. So in the mapping of the assessment, we got some very specific data about over 100 categories.
So we'll give you the abbreviated version, but just to give you a taste of some of the things that we came up with and the way we worked through it. So for example, one of the categories is hotels, and typically is thought of as a built environment feature, like we're gonna lose these many buildings and how much money does it cost to fix these buildings. Sometimes jobs are associated with that. But what we found in going through our study is we tried to, every map we processed through the built environment, through the social lens, through the ecologic lens. So when you do that, and it looks sort of like this, when you do that, you think about hotels, that's another 30 to 50,000 people that need to be evacuated or need to migrate during an event. It's also a source or a place where the responders or people helping with recovery are going to come stay. There's many social issues. And so we started to think about those also, and we're working with emergency management to help identify some of these factors. Let's see. Other aspects like tourists not being familiar with an event and not knowing where to go and what to do. So then also with sea level rise, you can think about, well, actually one fact is that with a Category 3 hurricane, I think it's 36 or 2% of all the hotels in Hillsborough County will be inundated or in the inundation area. So it's a big proportion of our hotel stock is within that Category 3 limit. And again, this is in 2045. And so then, when you look at where they are, a lot of our hotels are near coastal areas. We're capitalizing on our geography. But then, so it's just things to think about, right? And so then when you think about sea level rise, there's this other issue of, well, if we're all our hotels are on the water, there's issues of habitat migration, of seawalls being overwhelmed eventually with sea level rise. There are these other issues that we can start to think about. I'll try to go through some of these fairly quickly. So Superfund sites, you can see this one, they're clustered, and we think again of that as like a built environment thing. But when you look at Hurricane Florence, there were populations that lived near hazardous sites that were inundated with toxic water. And so these the buffer, the context of that cluster of hazardous sites is something also to be thinking about. People that don't have access to vehicles, especially within our sort of car-dominated county, there is a large proportion of people with lack of vehicle access, but they are also clustered. And so that might help emergency management start to think about how to address those communities. Single-parent families, again, so this one may think of it more as a social public health issue. But as we filtered it through those different lenses, we started to think, well, those people are really relying on community infrastructures. So schools are a big deal in these kind of neighborhoods, or rec centers, or places where childcare is available to let parents get back going after an event. So some of these things, right? So we're looking at them through all these different lenses. Wetlands, not so much, well, maybe where they are, but where there are not. And so when you look at the downtown South Tampa area, we're lacking wetland areas, and that really affects the capacity for drainage. So, and here's a fun fact for the economic aspect of wetlands also is here. So, okay, last one. Being that we are design thinkers at an urban level, we wanted, and me, I'm based in landscape and ecology, so taking a systems approach, thinking about this holistically, these vulnerabilities don't happen in isolation. So what we really wanted to think about is what are the systems of vulnerability and how maybe they start to isolated elements start to compound to create greater vulnerabilities.
So what we did was we showed you single layer data points, right, on top of those scenarios. And now what we're going to move into is actually showing what happens when we begin to layer sets of information and what it tells us about our communities. And then our hope is that this leads us into understanding how to mitigate for them.
So the example we show quite often lately is, so we have evacuation zones. So you would think maybe the people that aren't in an evacuation zone are sort of thought to stay in place. That map looks like this. But we also have significant building code changes in our history. So in 2002 was a major update after Andrew. And so when you look at where different housing stock was built at different times, that's another factor to layer in.
So when we think about impacts from storms, looking at our particularly older neighborhoods that were built before the 70s, especially, but also those built before the 2003 code changes, these are areas where we really do need to have a good understanding of how to help prepare those neighborhoods. But when you couple them with being a shelter-in-place area, and then you layer on.
So the last factor then would be if you have an old house, say your house was built in 1920s, but you're also low income and you don't have the means to fortify that house. That adds a layer of vulnerability or exposure to risk. So when you add all of those up, it creates a little bit more granular level map that we can possibly look at some of these specific areas and how we might target some of the ways to mitigate risk in these areas.
And neighborhoods that you'll see really pop out, I mean, Gibsonton, you'll see East Tampa, but there's a number of others where you have housing that is built before the code, people are low income. So when we look at that, we look at them not being able to harden their homes or make improvements for flood. But we also look at those houses knowing that they probably don't have resources for 2 weeks worth of supplies as recommended by FEMA, right? So there's a number of things that we have to think about when we start to layer on these different data sets.
And now, so there are many resource grants for communities like this, and that maybe those grants could be targeted or focused. And then another aspect of the mitigation piece is a little bit like what Lucia was saying earlier, I think, was that you can use these grants to better a whole community, possibly, not just attack one little component at a time. So with that, I really think that, time constraints allowed.
We'll take questions.
We can take questions.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Appreciate it very, very much. I don't see anyone. Commissioner Oberman, you recognize.
How much in consideration, I mean, I noticed your hotels, your map on hotels, and I was thinking about your assumptions that, we have people that are coming to the area to help with recovery and tourists. But in Florida, unfortunately, storms don't always go west to east. They go from east to west, too. And when they do, everybody from the East Coast is already in the hotels. How much did you observe of that? Because when I first moved, I moved here in '84, and Hurricane Elena set off the coast for a weekend and some, and I moved to Davis Island, and of course we're the very first evacuation zone. So they sent us. We had access to a hotel that was in the West Shore area, so we moved from one flood area to another flood area. The good news is multi-storied, so the first floor flooded, but the rest of the hotel was fine. So we were looking at, given the history of the storms that you took, but that becomes really a problem when you look at your slide that talks about low-income communities that don't have the resources, or the structure to shelter in place.
Mm-hmm. So specifically looking at transportation patterns, didn't quite look at that, but we are actually starting to work with Qatar. We're applying for a grant right now to study something just like that. And that when you look at, so a road corridor, you get 1 or 2 hotels every so often along its path at an off-ramp, let's say. Whereas when you have a more dense clustered area, you have maybe 3 or 4 hotels and maybe even more sheltering options, et cetera. And so that was a significant pattern. The same pattern is associated with emergency management services. So you may have a hotel along 75 somewhere, but you don't have any emergency management services. But if you go to Plant City, you'll have a hotel and emergency management services because of that kind of concentrated development pattern. So there was a direct association with transportation and the potential to be resilient to these types of.
And this is why we started layering those pieces, right, in the data sets, is because we knew that they all impacted one another, and being able to start understanding what those impacts look like will help us generate better recommendations for mitigation and risk reduction. So we really want to come up with as many risk reduction potentials as we can.
Commissioner Kemp, you recognized.
Thank you. I know more recently, we've heard a lot more about sheltering in place, that it doesn't make sense. And certainly there are places that are far safer from any storm when it hits, not on the coastline, not to be on the coastline, but inland. And we have our schools that serve as the place where people go to. In terms of that, I was a little surprised. Often when I hear about road widenings, the singular event that's brought up is, well, what if we have a hurricane? We need the road widened for a hurricane, which I always think is kind of like we need more parking spaces at the shopping mall for Black Friday, which we know isn't true anymore because everybody is buying online and there's tons of empty parking spaces on Black Fridays now and at the holidays. But I was surprised to see that the state, I believe this is correct, I was just reading it some months ago, that that there was a decision made under Governor Scott that instead of looking at any way that cars could move, that major interstates would be one-way for storm events, which makes a lot of sense to me when you're on a peninsula and we have these very routes. It would seem to me that one-waying the interstate primarily would be a good way of dealing with that. And I understand that there's state policy that moves away from that and moves instead to looking at widening for these events. And I just wondered, one, about that, and if you have any information about that or the effect of that. We do have here the expressway, which the Brandon Leroy Salmon Expressway, which is really good in that regard since it's way under capacity and has a lot of capacity and can already go one way inland. So I think that that's a really good advantage that we have when thinking about that. I also am wondering in terms of the vulnerabilities for low-income people, which you highlighted so well. We know in Katrina that there were tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people that were left behind because there wasn't transit available. And I remember seeing that come and thinking, how are they getting those people out? What transit is going to be there? So I also wondered in terms of that. I know that the CSX tracks go through a critical area that would be really good and could move lots of people. So I'm thinking about the impacts of that in our transit systems in terms of moving people to places where they can shelter in place. And finally, this is more a long-term type of question rather than an event type. But I know all over the county, I saw it in Apollo Beach in one block. I saw where you could see what year the houses were built, like in one street, because the earliest houses were on lowland. The houses built a little bit later were elevated, and the houses built the latest were way elevated. It looked very odd, but obviously we know what people are doing. I know that a lot of the new development is feet and feet above, which makes sense for the future in some ways, but also I'm wondering about how that in the long term, especially in big complexes, we hear that the water doesn't travel from them, but the evidence in many cases seems to be the opposite once it's built. And so I'm wondering about looking at that in terms of just day-to-day resiliency in the long term in our building codes, or how effective that is, and true information about that.
Okay, let's see if I can get a touch on all of these. So, widening of the interstate, one of the things that Brian mentioned is the vulnerabilities at the on and off ramps, right? So that's something that we have to really be aware of in terms of where people are getting on and off in an evacuation situation, and also where we have fuel resources along those evacuation routes, because when you look at the maps, they don't all line up as much as we would hope. So there's a number of considerations if we're looking at that. You brought up the vulnerable populations. We do have a large number of people who we would call transportation disadvantaged. And so those are people who are not going to have access to be able to evacuate. And so having preparations in place to be able to evacuate larger groups of people. What research has shown us is that rail lines are very effective at evacuating large groups of people, particularly if they are connected. So if the state of Florida had a connected system, right, it would be a way to be able to evacuate mass groups of people. The other benefit is in recovery. We would be able to get resources and people back in to restore kind of everything more quickly, which is something that we do have to take into consideration, especially if we want to restore the economy as quickly as possible.
Mr. Smith, you recognize.
Thank you. Very briefly. The coastal high hazard area, we've had policies in our comprehensive plan for decades that were to lower density in the coastal high hazard area because of the vulnerability that always existed there, and now that vulnerability is heightened with sea level rise and climate change. And so I think we have some things in our comprehensive plan that we can emphasize more and use more, enforce more with our own policies, and that our planners can use more in their recommendations in terms of directing growth. We're learning of other areas, and you can see the Lithia River area is especially vulnerable to flood every time we've had recent rain events. Interestingly, the Little Manatee River, where I live, is not anywhere near as vulnerable because it has been left in such a natural condition. It's one of the few undammed rivers in Florida, and we have with ELAP preserved an awful lot of the wetlands and natural buffers along that shore, where the Lithia River has hardened shorelines and developed much more densely up to its shore. And so, that points out, as we've been learning in our other presentations, the benefits of natural protections, even more than, as we learned in EPC meeting the other day, even more than hardened seawalls and raising things above the floodplain, which is another thing where the citizens are really concerned and raising concerns that these especially large developments are raising themselves out of the floodplain, and great for them, but extra water runoff flooding the other neighborhoods. And so I think we need to consider these and in the doing part, in the actual directing of growth. This is very useful information if we use it. And the other thing that pops out of your maps to me that I realized finally that I did not say to Lucia and Melissa were the extra benefits. We are now learning about infill and redevelopment and transit-oriented development and smart growth policies, you know, not only for lifestyle and quality of life, but even for safety and for protections of vulnerable populations and in resiliency. So just to note to our circling back, that's something that I forgot to mention. I would like to see emphasized infill and redevelopment on what we want to see. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Appreciate you being
Can
here.
I just say one
Sure.
quick thing? I just, so that you're informed, part of our project, we are working with and have a grant to work with TU Delft in the Netherlands. So
I'm sorry.
TU Delft in the Netherlands is probably the preeminent university in the world that's working on flood issues.
And you want us to go to the Netherlands?
No,
Oh, okay.
we are. I mean, you're welcome to join. We have a great schedule lined up. But so we're going there, and we've been there. We took a class there last spring, and we're going in November, and we have ongoing collaboration. So it's just, you know, as a resource, I want you all to know that that's available, and we're continuing that.
So we've been studying the flood infrastructure with them, as well as looking at some of their governmental structures
Right.
that they have in place. They have a project called Room for the River. It's 39 projects. It covers multiple jurisdictions and municipalities, and so understanding how that collaboration happened is one of the things we're interested in.
Okay. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Pretty good. Commissioners, Lucia Garces, Deputy County Administrator. Just want to wrap up in terms of next steps. So we heard a lot. Even what we heard from the Florida Design Center on the vulnerability study really does start to emphasize the importance of transportation corridors and concentration of places, whether they're nodes or communities. But a lot of what was said, and the protection actually of the rural lands for making sure that the sponge continues to have capacity. So it penetrates a lot of different components, as you heard, everything from land use infrastructure, even the equity piece, and then how it affects where we build, how we build, and how we move people. But I wanted to go back to the first part of the conversation, because what Melissa and I just talked, we owe you. We want to update the list of what we heard, ensure that that is out there. And then we want to take all the different pieces of what you believe is important and schedule that and start structuring that. A workshop on perhaps the economic development and incentives piece. How do those two pieces together, understanding where that is. But I think that is our next step, is to bring back those, turn this into a program and get it scheduled into a series of workshops perhaps, or pieces at board meetings. But I'm getting really close to 11 o'clock, so I'm going to stop talking. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Well, let me thank you and Mrs. Onita. Let me thank the members here for your input and your foresight of where we need to go in our next steps, and having a collegial, cooperative conversation today about growth and what we need to do about growth. Mr. Onita, Ms. Garces, come back to the podium, please. In the early 1980s, I was a planning commissioner. And the planning commission in Hillsborough County were like the McCoys and Hatfields. We did not get along. There was battles constantly. And as this board moved forward after we got here, we basically mandated to you all to start working together with Mr. Merrill, Ms. Garces, and Mr. Onita, that the planning commission and the county had to work together. We're going to have this county moving in the right direction. To have you both standing at this podium today, giving a presentation, it happened. And we want to thank both of you for doing that. And Mr. Merrill, thank you for taking the lead in making sure the county and the county and the planning commission started working together. Also, Ms. Doherty, with the EPC is involved, that's a major, major step also. So thank you very much. Keep it up. Keep working together as we move forward and making this county the best it possibly can be for each and every one in this county. We appreciate it very, very much. With that, we'll adjourn.
Thank you. Thank you.